What's going on YouTube? It's Deej, back again with another video, and today I'm handing out my head coach hiring predictions, and I'm going on a little bit of a limb on one of them because that opening is not officially there, but after the wild card weekend that was, especially on Sunday, I think there's going to be one more job that we hear about pretty soon. I am recording this the day of seeing this, so, you know, by the time you see it, it's a couple hours after, so maybe this news is broke, but we'll get there once we get there. But let me hear your head coaching hiring predictions. Who goes to Atlanta? Who goes to the Chargers? You know, where does Harbaugh end up? What about Antonio Pierce? Does he stay in Vegas? I want to hear all your predictions and thoughts down below, especially if one of your favorite teams is involved in this hiring cycle. Who is your prediction? So we're going to go team by team. I'm going to start by talking about Gerard Mayo in this New England situation because I had prediction. I was going to have Mike Vrabel be my prediction, but obviously they decided to forego the hiring process and going through those interviews, and they had something built into Gerard Mayo's contract. We'll come back to that. In the very end of this video, I have a full list of the other guys who have basically gotten head coaching interviews and where I think they end up next year as coordinators, maybe in the mix for different head coaching jobs. Things like that. Just kind of giving you a debrief of what I think ends up happening in this hiring cycle, where all these guys end up. So let's go ahead and start with Gerard Mayo. I don't hate this hire. I think Vrabel comes with a little bit more certainty because you've seen him, get a number one seed with a roster that had more players, on the active roster than ever before in an NFL season, just because of how dinged up they were. And they went 12-5, got the one seed, like I said, made it to an AFC Championship game. It was a steady decline, but I don't think that was at all Mike Vrabel's fault. That being said, I'm really excited for Gerard Mayo because when you look at that built-in clause, a succession clause essentially, I'm really glad that Mayo got it over someone like Josh McDaniels. One, because we've seen what happens with McDaniels as a head coach, but secondly, look, there's a lot of coaches around the league that look like Josh McDaniels, not trying to push any buttons here or get political or anything like that, but there are just not as many minority head coaching opportunities or head coaches out there in general. So I really love that this succession plan fell onto a guy who, he's only been a linebackers coach, but has lived the Patriot way as a player as well as the coach, and had a heavy hand in there with Steve Belichick calling plays and running that side. Even if Steve Belichick was calling the plays, there's more involved being a coordinator. It's personnel and it's management. It's snap counts, especially with injuries, stuff like that. And he had his hand in that. So this is a guy who's lived, breathed, eat the Patriot way, and I love that they're giving a succession opportunity to a young African-American man, and I don't want to say young, he's in his mid-30s, but younger for an NFL head coach. And then real quick, kind of leaving that, really interested to see how this coaching tree blooms throughout the rest of the offseason for New England. Do you bring back Bill O'Brien? I could see a world where you give him a different quarterback, maybe that works out a little better, but it was a stagnant offense, and there's a lot of work to be done, talent side, but also I think from a play calling standpoint. And I will say, if they do decide to move on, I don't think Josh McDaniels is coming back. Maybe he goes where Belichick goes. We'll talk about him later, but I think this is a more appealing OC job. I think they could land a relatively big name. It may cost a little bit of extra money, but I also think it's more appealing to go be an OC now for Gerard Mayo than having Bill Belichick over your shoulder. Because head coaches want to have input on that. You hear the stories of, in the Super Bowl where the Falcons lost to the Patriots, Dan Quinn's telling Shanahan to run the ball more. Pete Carroll's had that throughout his different OCs, and I'm sure Belichick has done the same thing. Tomlin's had the same stuff in Pittsburgh, where that happens from time to time. I think with Mayo there, he's going to be pretty hands-off. I think he's going to let you be the offensive coordinator and let you do your job, at least until things get pretty dire. And I just don't know if you're going to have that with Bill Belichick. So I almost see more creative freedom, and also a younger head coach. I think we saw Bill Belichick was stuck in his ways. I know Matt Patricia, so we'll see what he can do as the OC. I know Bill O'Brien, let's bring him back. I know Josh McDaniels, let's keep him around as long as we can. I think Gerard Mayo is going to look towards the future. I think young guys just naturally are like, okay, cool. Just because it worked 20 years ago doesn't mean it's going to work for the next 20. So I could see him also ushering in a new offensive era. And then the last question I have with this coaching staff is Steve Belichick. Does he go with Bill, or does he stay in New England as the play caller? I could see it going one of two ways. That defense went way beyond expectations. Again, we'll talk about Belichick later, and I think he had a heavy hand in that. But Steve Belichick was the DC. So does he want to make his own legacy in New England, or is he just going to follow Pops? I really could see it break out either way. And if he does follow, I wouldn't be shocked if Gerard Mayo ends up just being the defensive play caller. Anyways, just want to talk about that just because that hiring's already been made. So let's talk about the Vegas Raiders. I'm going to talk about each team just a little bit and then get into my prediction. This is a team that I think especially once Antonio Pierce became the interim head coach, this roster had its results maximized given the talent that was on it. And because of that, this has got to be Antonio Pierce for me. In my last mock, I even made this case. I had J.J. McCarthy be the pick because I was like, if this Harbaugh rumor's true, I think he's sprinting this card to the podium, but it really should be Antonio Pierce. Because, one, if you're Mark Davis, I have a hard time thinking you want to see history repeat itself. Rich Bisaccia, interim, takes you to the playoffs, you hire McDaniels, it's a disaster. I just can't see him wanting to do that again. Also, like, I know Mark Davis has millions upon millions of dollars, way more than I'll ever probably see in my life. But at the same time, like, he shut out a ton of cash to Gruden, had to terminate that early. He shut out a ton of cash to McDaniels, had to terminate that early. Does he really want to go out there and, splurge on Harbaugh? Even if he's not looking to become the highest paid coach in the league, like, that's going to be more expensive than Antonio Pierce. So, I don't know. I could see where he just wants to stick with continuity, but also stick on the cheaper side. And, is that fair to Antonio Pierce? Probably not. But that being said, I think that might be a determining factor here, because that was a huge talking point for why they didn't move on from Josh McDaniels after year one, is because of how much money they still had to pay him, no matter what, whether he was there or not. So I could see them kind of err on the more cheap side, which again, probably not fair to say that about Antonio Pierce, because I think he's done a fantastic job. I mean, winning Kansas City, when was the last time the Raiders did that? It was a long time ago. And it just, again, maximizing the talent on that roster, because they're talking about, a day 3 rookie starting quarterback, and Max Crosby's a stud, Nate Hobbs is a good player, but, what else is really there on that defense? So him and Patrick Graham, hopefully they retain these guys. We'll talk about Graham a little bit later on, but huge fan of what Antonio Pierce has done, and especially after the Lions win a playoff game yesterday. Like, I think Mark Davis is going to look at this and be like, this guy has the locker room. I don't want to mess that up. And I think, the coordinators that kind of stepped into roles ultimately did a great job. I mean, Patrick Graham's fantastic, but the interim offense coordinator, whose name's escaping me now, did a pretty solid job. And I think did a pretty good job working with Aiden O'Connell in specific. So I think he just maintained status quo there in Las Vegas. Let's get to the Los Angeles Chargers. I mean, like, this is a fun job because Justin Herbert's there, but it's a team with massive salary cap holes to dig out of. And it also has like an aging veteran receiver that battled injuries, a younger receiver who cannot stay healthy, a first-round pick at receiver that, to this point, through 1 year, looks like a major disappointment. Running back about to hit the market. The defense needs an overhaul, and because of that, to me, there's only one guy for this job, and it's Jim Harbaugh. Like, once I saw this, I was like, this makes even more sense than the Belichick one, because this guy's a program builder. Look back to when he first got to San Francisco, and look at the roster before he got there, and then 2 years after. Like, he turned it all around. Like, he basically upended that roster, except for, the stars like a Patrick Willis, right? And I think he's going to do the same thing. Like, he's going to have Justin Herbert be a piece of continuity there. Maybe some of the other young guys like a Tuli Tuipulotu and Asante Samuel Jr., Derwin James. But otherwise, man, I think he just tears this down over a year or two. And if he gets hired this offseason, it could start right away. And I think they hire him pretty quick. Like, I think honestly, if it's January 15th right now when I'm recording this, by the end of this month, I'm pretty confident that he's going to be the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. One of my more confident ones. And if you're wondering order, not really any specific order. It's just AFC than NFC teams. But I feel pretty confident that he's going to be the head coach of the Chargers, and he's going to get to work quick. And this offseason, plus the next one, I think the Chargers are giving the Chiefs a run for their money. Like, I'm buying in, and the reason I think Los Angeles makes more sense than Vegas, yes, Vegas is very close to California, but this guy has the roots through California, Stanford, San Francisco, and LA is not the Bay Area, but I think he's heading back there. And also, like, they're going to give him player control. Like, he's going to have the full roster, and I think Vegas would too, but I think Antonio Pierce has that locker room, and Max Crosby going to request a trade. I think Devontae Adams will request a trade if they don't keep Pierce, so this makes it all the easier for the Chargers to land Jim Harbaugh, which this would make me super excited. And this is the guy that also kind of unlocked Alex Smith, right? And then you get to Colin Kaepernick. I know Greg Roman's the play caller, but that was for the best years we saw of Colin Kaepernick, right, too? So I would just love to see what he could do for Justin Herbert. And this is a team that needs a direction, and Jim Harbaugh gives you that. All right, let's go on the Tennessee Titans. Fun team because you have an idea of who the quarterback's going to be for the future. It is a little bit of a turning of the page, though. No more Derrick Henry, no more Ryan Tannehill. That era's come to a close. You have a former first-round pick at receiver, another young guy in Kyle Phillips who's pretty solid, Chigakonkwo, decent player. The defense could use an overhaul, but there's still some exciting pieces like a Jeffrey Simmons there, and a couple pieces in the secondary that aren't god-awful, specifically like an Elijah Molden, right? But yeah, this is a team that needs a complete overhaul. I think this is going to be a slow process. I'm going to go Bobby Slowick here. Partially because Rand Carthon's there, comes from that San Francisco front office. So I think, the continuity between him and Slowick makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I know Bobby Slowick was a first-year play caller this year, but he's been a position coach at both offense and the defensive side of the ball. His dad, longtime NFL coach as well. So it's in his DNA. It's in his roots. And I think this is a Tennessee team that's not looking to make a head coaching hire and immediately compete next year. I think they're going to have, like, Bobby Slowick, like, by year 3 expectations kick in, not year 1, if that makes sense. And also, like, after looking at that, Houston showcase, like, Stroud was fantastic. Nico Collins was awesome, but a lot of that Houston win over Cleveland was Bobby Slowick saying, this team wants to play aggressive, and I'm going to give them every bait and switch that I possibly can. And like the Dalton Schultz touchdown, like he made that secondary, which had been one of the best secondaries in football, he exploited their strength and turned it into a weakness. And I mean, how could you not want that guy calling plays? And also like what they did with Myles Garrett, like didn't even chip him often, but just having a tight end cluster and congest that area, running back, running routes out there. They just, little things like that. He just takes advantage of those little 1% edge. And also the 49ers have been, maybe outside of clock management, I think from a front office perspective, they're quick to move on from bad decisions, but they also embrace analytics and embrace position value. And I think this is a roster that kind of needs that. And I think Slowick will kind of just reinforce that. Need to overhaul corners, need to overhaul tackles, needs more receivers. Like I think these are the guys who can evaluate those positions and really land on those selections that are ultimately going to determine whether Tennessee turns us around in a year or two. So I love the Bobby Slowick pick. I know he's a 1-year play caller, but he's got way more experience beyond just that. And I think him and Carthon would have a good working relationship. Then we get to the Washington Commanders as we switch over to the NFC. Man, like, it's a fun job. This was a really appealing job because you're going to get one of the top 2 picks in the draft. You're going to get Caleb or Drake or, maybe Jaden Daniels if they view him that highly. But the way Rick Spielman talks about Caleb Williams, if he's there at 2, sheesh, I do not see him staying on the board beyond that. But you also have Terry McLaurin and you have John Dotson. You have young talent there. A couple of decent backs. The offensive line needs an overhaul for sure, but, a couple of signings, a couple of draft picks, you can make that happen relatively quick and at least get closer to average. And this is a defense that, needs a lot of work. Really needs pieces at all 3 levels. But if they bring back Cam Curl, at least you have one of those cornerstone pieces. You have a Jonathan Allen there. So there's in Deron Payne as well. You still have pieces to be excited about. And I basically heard this is all but confirmed. This is going to be Ben Johnson, which is super exciting, right? Like, because you're talking about putting a Drake May or a Caleb Williams. Let's just say for sake of the argument, it's Caleb Williams in the hands of a guy who, did you see that Lions game last night? On script, but then also throughout that first half, that offense was rolling. And really, like, I think part of the genius of Ben Johnson is, like, everyone thinks, and myself included, like, I want to push the ball through the air. I want to win through the passing attack. Ben Johnson, like, the Lions and the Eagles, which, the Eagles aren't as much of a bragging point for this, but the Lions are one of the top 2 teams in the league at running on third and mediums, just because it's the last thing you expect. Like, he's not afraid to run the football. He just wants to do the thing that the defense is least expecting come in their way. And I think you look at, like, the Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery backfield. I think Antonio Gibson or even Chris Rodriguez, or Brian Robinson. Like, I think there's a running back committee where you can almost emulate it a little bit. We'll see what happens with Gibson this offseason. Maybe that's a piece. They decided to move on, or they just draft a guy to kind of fill that role. But kind of that, thunder and lightning approach, plus those receivers. Like, really, in Detroit, Ben Johnson had Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then he was scheming other dudes open. And Jameson Williams brings a ton of speed. But I think he's got even more receiver talent, really. And then the DC hires can be key here for sure because, I don't know how much of a hand he really wants to have in that. So maybe this is a team that just shells out some cash to Mike Vrabel if he doesn't land a job, to Brian Flores if he's willing to leave Minnesota, or, something like that. Or maybe they lure a guy out of retirement, kind of like what Sean McVay did with Wade Phillips. Maybe they do something like that. One shot, or even like kind of Vic Fangio going to Miami. So I think this is the right direction for this offense to go. And plus, just think about the offseason here for Washington. First offseason with Josh Harris as the owner. I think there's a ton of excitement about hiring, a 49ers exec, Adam Peters. The way that structure, that front office runs, Washington fans want to see that. And you land the top head coaching candidate, not named Jim Harbaugh. That's going to create a ton of excitement for this fan base, which they need. And then you draft a quarterback at 2, and all of a sudden it feels like it's a brand new era for Washington. Then we get to the Dallas Cowboys. This is the team I was talking about off the top. As of recording this, and I'm checking my phone just to make sure, nope, no official word yet that they have moved on from Mike McCarthy, but I have heard nothing short of that he needed to win at least one playoff game, maybe 2, especially considering once they got the 2 seed, it was 2-7. That's, if you're not going to have a first-round bye, that is technically the easiest path you can have. And man, Sunday was just a meltdown. They just, across the board, like, I know the second half they made things interesting, and Dak all of a sudden has 300 plus yards and like 3 tuds or 4 tuds, whatever it was. CD gets over 100. But we're gonna talk about Dan Quinn later, but I didn't love the game that he called. Honestly, I think Green Bay just kind of almost similar to what Houston did with Cleveland, a team that wants to play a lot of man coverage. They just use that team's aggressiveness against them. But whoever steps in this role, like, the expectations are set high. This is a team that has been really good in the regular season, had a ton of success. They just can't get over that hump, but that's why you got to move on from Mike McCarthy. Like, I think back to the Ravens, like, moving on from Wink Martindale and Greg Roman was not an easy decision because they've had good years under both those guys. But good doesn't cut it. Good doesn't win championships. Great does. And that's why you got to move on from Mike McCarthy. He's been a good coach. They've had good years. They've had good success. The Dallas Cowboys, though, you're aiming for great. So you got to bring in the greatest head coach of all time. Also, I just got a note here. All these cutouts that I have are like waist up or mid body up. This one I had to put in here. I mean, what a fit! I mean, this guy looks like anybody else taking their dog out at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. Just what an absolute legend. This guy has won more Super Bowls than most franchises. Awesome. But yeah, I think this is the guy, right? Like. Also, like, we're going to talk about Dan Quinn. I do have him landing a job, and it's a pretty obvious one. So if you lose Dan Quinn, like, who's a guy that can bring in a defensive philosophy that maintains that side of the ball, that, maybe they won't lead the league in turnovers like they have over the last 3 years. Maybe they won't be top 5 in sacks like they've been over the last 3 years. But they'll be pretty high in regards to EP per play and defensive efficiency, success rate, all that stuff, because look at what the Patriots did this year, especially after Matt Judon and Christian Gonzalez go down. That team had no business being as good as they were, and they're still, widely considered a top 10 to 12 defense without 2 of their best players, maybe their 2 best defensive players. That's crazy. That shouldn't happen. And I know some of that's Steve Belichick, some of that's Gerard Mayo, and a lot of it's Bill Belichick too. So I think this is the guy that maintains that status quo on the defensive side, but also just brings a different pedigree in regards to playoff expectations. And really, since that Super Bowl for Mike McCarthy, this has been a huge bump in the road that he cannot get over. And Bill Belichick, I know it's not been the same without Brady, but he has had a ton of postseason success. And sometimes, too, you just need to change it up a little bit. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. You can keep a lot of it the same, but just change up one small piece, and that one tweak might be ultimately the difference. This would be really interesting, though, if you bring in Bill Belichick. I don't think it's Josh McDaniels coming at the OC. Maybe you can keep Brian Schottenheimer there. I don't love that, especially considering Mike McCarthy was the guy calling the plays here, and I actually think he did an okay job. And we'll talk about Mike McCarthy here. I didn't add him to the who's left. Let's actually just talk about him now. If he does get the can, I'm really intrigued to see if Carolina jumps on that. Just because, 12-5, I almost use Jared Goff as the perfect example. Granted, he did get a playoff win yesterday, but, different coaches, the same thing can be true, but for different franchises, that could be a reason to move on for one and a reason to make that move for another. For Dallas, one postseason win over the last 4 years, sorry, got to cut bait. Got to move on. But for Carolina, you're looking at a guy who had the number 1 scoring offense. Dak Prescott, an MVP candidate. CeeDee Lamb might win Offensive Player of the Year. David Tepper might be yeah, okay, we'll get to the playoffs when we get there. Let's have this guy help us get into a winning record in a year or two. So keep an eye out if Mike McCarthy has moved on from. I think David Tepper could go out there and try to get an experienced head coach. It does kind of feel, Frank Reich, he's had a lot of success, and almost kind of feels similar ground that we're treading on there. But I wouldn't be shocked whatsoever. But I think Bill Belichick, this OC hire would be huge. And I'd be really curious to see what he does. And honestly, I have no idea what direction he'd go. No idea. I would just hope that it's in a direction that it's not, I've worked with Bill O'Brien again, so let's bring him back. I've worked with Josh McDaniels. I know we can make this work. Let's bring him back. Think outside the box here, Bill. Think outside the box. And I don't know. Maybe Kellen Moore ends up being moved on from in LA. Wouldn't shock me. Maybe there's a reunion in the foreseeable future there. It'd be interesting to see. One other thing I want to talk about here. There has been reported a mystery team that could be in on Bill Belichick that have not fired their coach. Everyone jumped and said the Cowboys. And, I think that makes a lot of sense, clearly, because that's what I'm doing here. But I think Brad Spielberg on the Yins No Ball podcast, if you're a Steelers fan, can't recommend it enough. Great podcast. Brad's a genius, too. He's great at what he does. He laid out a really interesting thought that it could be Tampa Bay. And again, he lays it out really well. It's hard not to kind of buy into it a little bit. And since everyone's jumping on Dallas, truly, who would be the mystery team? Not the one that everyone jumps at, right? Everyone assumed, okay, Dallas must be that team. Jason Light has said a lot of things that basically make it out to paint the picture that Bill Belichick's one of his biggest mentors, especially when it comes to a football side, but just maybe as a human, right? Bill Belichick might be one of the guys that he most looks up to. And, Bill's willing to, take a step back in player personnel, which if he's going to Dallas, I certainly hope he is, because Will McClay, let that man cook. And even Stephen Jones, a pretty solid roster management guy and evaluator. But McClay is one of the best in the biz. So he's going to have to take a step back from that regard if he wants to go to Dallas. But him and Jerry have a good relationship. They can have an amicable working relationship and make that work. And I think that might be even more true in Tampa Bay with him and Jason Light. That could be really interesting. Also, I originally had him going to Atlanta when I planned out this video, but then, the Dallas lost yesterday. I was like, yeah, they're moving on from McCarthy. There's no way. So Atlanta makes a lot of sense. And for all the reasons that Atlanta makes sense, moving on from New England, you're staying on the East Coast, same time zone, but it's way warmer, kind of way more applicable for someone in their mid-70s. You've got to feel like an environment they want to pseudo-retire to / retire to. Atlanta makes a lot of sense, but Tampa Bay makes even more sense. And, it'd be kind of interesting to see what would happen, because then we have even more A/B testing. Well, when Brady went to Tampa, this is what happened. Well, when Belichick went to Tampa, this is what happened. That would be really, really interesting. And then, yeah, that's I don't know. It's something about that. It's just living in the back of my brain. We'll see what happens. Obviously, tonight's the Monday night game, but if the Buccaneers get embarrassed, They probably would have fired Todd Bowles if they didn't make the playoffs. So what's the difference between making the playoffs and then just getting smoked the next game, especially against a struggling Eagles team? I don't know. Just something to keep your eyes on. I mean, something to think about. How about check to Tampa? That might be the true mystery team here. But I do have him going to Dallas and also kind of just following the footsteps of his mentor, Bill Parcells, going out to Dallas. It'd be a fun storyline echoing and having history repeat itself there. And then we get to Atlanta Falcons. Again, this was where I originally had Belichick going, but then obviously made some changes here. Because of that, you want the New England way. I mean, I think Vrabel had a lot of that in Tennessee. There's going to be one other job where I do note the coordinator hire because I think it's massive. You have to include that. So I think this would be a situation where you bring in Mike Vrabel, and just as much as the headline is we're hiring Mike Vrabel, former head coach of the number 1 seed Tennessee Titans, we're bringing in Frank Smith, offensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins. Yeah, I wouldn't call him plays, but we're going to bring that philosophy to a team that features Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, Cordero Patterson. Hopefully, if they bring him back, I think he'd be a great fit for Frank Smith and what they want to do if they do emulate this Miami offense. All on top of top 10 pick Drake London, top 10 pick. Top 5 pick for that matter, Kyle Pitts. That's an offense that's loaded with personnel, and you're telling me, they're bringing over the Miami OC? That probably sparks a ton of excitement there for that fan base. So once I moved Belichick, I was like, okay, cool. This could be the opportunity for them to get a culture guy, that New England-esque energy, because there's a lot of former New England guys that still kind of live in the ear of Arthur Blank, former GMs and former execs and whatnot, just kind of giving out their advice and their 2 cents. So I could totally see Vrabel being a guy that they pass on and highly recommend as a leader and as a culture guy and as a leader of the locker room. And then I would highly encourage him to keep Ryan Nielsen. I think Ryan Nielsen did a fantastic job leading that defense. And Vrabel can certainly have input, but I would imagine they keep Ryan Nielsen, and then just as much as the headline is Mike Vrabel's the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, Frank Smith's coming over, and we're going to try to maximize. We're going to take this Miami offense and plug in a Bijan and plug in an Algier, a London, a Pitts, all that sort of stuff. And we're going to have to find the quarterback of the future, which, if you're doing that Miami thing, Justin Fields would be really, really interesting here and allow you to keep your number 1 or your first round pick. That would be really interesting. Let me know what you think, because, I know everyone was thinking Vrabel to New England, Vrabel to New England. And I think it made a lot of sense, but they decided to keep Gerard Mayo, forego all the interview process. But if he doesn't go to Atlanta and he doesn't get a head coaching job, this is a guy who could get paid an absolute bag to be a defensive coordinator. And even kind of going back, some guys that might need a DC, Washington, right? Could they just be like, hey, Mike, you didn't get a head coaching job. You want to be the DC here in the nation's capital? We'll make you the second highest paid or highest paid defensive coordinator in the league. And he might just be like, yeah, that's cool, sweet, sounds good. And then 2 other teams I would keep an eye on that might do the same thing, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Philadelphia, I think just because it's dude, Sean Desai, that is obviously not working. Matt Patricia, that's just kind of a Band-Aid over an issue. They're looking for a huge improvement there, not only in roster, the talent on that side of the ball, but the play caller side. So could they make him the highest paid DC? Wouldn't shock me if he doesn't get a head coaching job. And then most people think of Vrabel as a New England Patriot, and some people even my age might think of him as a Kansas City Chief, but he was drafted in the 3rd round by the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, I don't think Terrell Austin has been the worst DC in the league. I know Tomlin has a lot of input there, but also every week you see at least 1 or 2 defensive miscommunications. And obviously the weather probably keeps the Steelers from being totally blown out and dragged through the mud. But I don't know if they give them a ton of plays here. It might just be a full staff revamp below Tomlin, right? Okay, we got to nail this OC hire, but also we got to make some changes on the defensive side. And maybe they could, maybe they'd be willing to shell out some money for Vrabel. He's willing to go back to the team that drafted him. Just a couple of ideas there for DC's landing spots for Vrabel. Washington, Philly, and Pittsburgh, I think all really do make a lot of sense. Let me get to Seattle. I'll be quick here. This one's simple. For a guy that's had as many head coaching interviews, it felt like he was waiting for the right job, which is smart. And I think this is one of those jobs where it's okay, this makes all the sense in the world for why he would want to go back. And honestly, I'd be here for it, right? You get to keep the Pete Carroll way, but with a little bit of a different voice and a little bit of a different mentality. Hopefully, he would also bring Al Harris there to the Great Northwest, because I want to see Al Harris, what he's done with Diggs and Bland, and Gilmore's already been great, but kind of having a renaissance year. I want to see him get his hands on these uber talented young corners like a Kobe Bryant, like a Devon Witherspoon, like a Arik Woolen. Man, that could be a ton of fun. That could be a really, really exciting addition. And all of a sudden, that secondary could be one of the best in football, because I think there's talent there. You get Al Harris, who's the best DBs coach hands down in the NFL right now. That's super intriguing. All on top of how Dan Quinn used stunts and twists and movement across that defensive line. This is a very athletic defensive line. Derek Hall screaming inside against a guard. Good luck with that, with that arm length. That's literally why most guys play guard, because they have short, stubby arms. Derek Hall is going to exploit that. Boy, Mafe, with his athletic ability of screaming across the face of a left guard, you're not catching up to him. Draymond Jones, really athletic and nimble guy. Maybe they add a guy in the draft there for the interior. I think Dan Quinn's philosophy makes a ton of sense. And now it would just be hinged on, can you get Al Harris to coach up that secondary? I could also see a world where Dallas just pays him ungodly amount of money for a defensive back coach and keep him there. I don't know. Or maybe Green Bay. They're like, hey, man, you want to come back to your old stomping grounds? We'll make you the defensive coordinator. Like, I don't know if he wants that. I think he'd just rather coach DBs, but I could definitely be wrong on that as well. And then the OC hire here is huge. Maybe he can lure Schottenheimer, obviously a guy who, has some overlap with Dan Quinn, both in Seattle as well as Dallas, of course, this year to be the OC. I don't love that. If they move on from McCarthy, Dallas does. Maybe he's willing to become an OC because he was a really good play caller. And I say that as someone who doesn't believe in Mike McCarthy as a head coach. But damn, what he did as a play caller was fantastic this year. He was easily one of the top 8 to 10 play callers, in my opinion, this season. Over the course of the season, not just each individual game. There's some variance there. Shane Waldron, can you keep him around? It feels like I feel like Chicago's going to do anything they can to get him. I'd love to see him in Pittsburgh, too, for what that's worth. But maybe Dan Quinn can be like, hey, man, come on. Stick around here. The other name to keep an eye on is Dave Canales, but we'll talk about that once we get to the other guys' list. Last one to talk about here, the Carolina Panthers. We all know the Carolina Panthers situation. They're looking to fix that offense. They need to make Bryce Young work. And I will say, alternatively, there was going to be a second candidate here, and it was going to be the other Baltimore Ravens coordinator, because I hate getting through all these, head coaching predictions and no job for Brian Flores. That makes absolutely no sense. Guy with 2 10-win seasons and absolutely maximized the value of that Minnesota defense. He definitely should be a head coach. And then I originally had Mike McDonald partnered up with Frank Smith as the OC. That was going to be like, you hire Mike McDonald, who's the guy who shut down the San Francisco offense. He shut down the Miami offense the next week. Here you go. He's going to be the guy pulling the strings on that side of the ball. Oh, and that, going along with the headline, kind of like what we used with Vrabel and Frank Smith. Frank Smith's going to be the OC. We're bringing that Miami offense here to Carolina, and that's going to make Bryce Young all the better. And he's going to be our Tua. Plus, we're going to load up this offense with weapons. We're going to sign a T. Higgins, all that sort of stuff. Like, I could totally see a world where that still happens, but ultimately, I decided to change my opinion with Frank Smith going to Atlanta. I think that'd be a good place for him to go, play in a dome. Like, I think that could maximize that offense. Makes sense. So here, I think you go Todd Monken. And I mean, look at his last 2 years. How could you not be impressed with him? And I know he's not like the sexy, like, oh, this is Ben Johnson. He's going to get the best out of Bryce Young. But like 2 years ago, he's at Georgia, and he turned Stetson Bennett into a guy who's being carried to a national championship by the greatest defense of all time, into that second of the back-to-back ships. Stetson Bennett was a huge reason why Georgia got that second ship. And then you look at him this year, Lamar Jackson's great. They've overhauled and revamped that receiving core with a first-rounder in Zay Flowers. They signed an OBJ. Yes, totally. Isaiah likely coming into his own. But Todd Monken's a huge reason why Lamar Jackson's going to win MVP. Like, they just went from Greg Roman. They moved on from good, tried to strive for great. And then all of a sudden, it's like you put a great athlete in a spread offense where there's a ton of room around him. Good things happen. Oh, my God, there's bigger passing windows, wider windows for him to throw in. Oh, and there's always open space for him to run into. Like, I'm getting so fired up. Like, it just made all the sense in the world. So, no-brainer hire. And I think, honestly, like, Carolina could look in the same way. Like, Bryce Young's no athlete like Lamar Jackson, but he can still be nimble and move the ball around, but also just spreading this out, spreading the field, stretching a defense out, wider windows for a guy to be able to make those throws, but also implementing some of the yards after they catch stuff. I think it makes a ton of sense. And at this point, like, I think Ben Johnson's going to get a good bag from Washington. I think Harbaugh's going to get pretty well paid to go to the Chargers. Also, I think he wants to go back to California or at least Vegas, somewhere there on the West Coast. There's not a whole lot of great high-end offensive minds other than Mike McCarthy. Like, Mike McCarthy would be the other guy here, and maybe I should have changed it. Mike McCarthy, and then you keep Ejiro Evero as the DC. But I decided that, and I think they're going to keep Ejiro Evero as the DC. They've already blocked other defensive coordinator interviews that he's had. The only thing he can do now is interview for a head coaching job. But honestly, I think he strikes me as a guy that's like, that's too much responsibility. I'm a good defensive play caller. That's all I really have interest in doing. And honestly, good on him. Like, if you have that much restraint and know what you're good at and don't want the added responsibilities and all the potential mediocrity and hate and criticism that comes with it, I think it's a really smart career move. So you keep Ejiro Evero around, running that side of the ball. Todd Monken, different offensive philosophy. Still spend in free agency to overhaul that receiving core. Draft a guy, maybe 2 guys in this loaded receiver class. To me, it makes all the sense in the world. But again, Mike McCarthy, a guy to keep your eye on here if Dallas does move on from him. All right, let's fly through some of the other guys. I think Eric Bieniemy, if Harbaugh doesn't go to LA, I think he does end up being their guy. But I think a couple of offensive coordinator jobs are interesting. If Mike McDonald is hired by some team, like, could they bring in a Bieniemy? I don't think Washington's going to retain him, especially if they do land Ben Johnson, which it sounds like that's going to be the direction they move in. But I think Pittsburgh is actually one, and I am a Steelers fan, so like, let's get that out of the way. I'm recommending, hey, Vrabel, if he doesn't get head coaching, let's make him the DC and let's bring Bieniemy in as the OC. And that being said, like 2 years ago, if you told me Bieniemy was the head coach or the offensive coordinator for Pittsburgh, I'd have been through the moon. I'd have been like, oh, absolutely worth the experiment. Let's go see. This is a year where Terry McLaurin should have had way better separation numbers and actually was towards the bottom of the league there. And, there's a couple of big games for McLaurin, but it almost all coincides with when Brissett's on the field. Jahan Dotson, 2 or 3 big games. Curtis Samuel, kind of weirdly, 2 or 3 big games. But, that offense did not click as much as it should have. And, how much that's Howell, how much that's the offensive line, questions to be asked there. But I also think of this as a culture standpoint. Like, Mike Tomlin's noted to be a very laissez-faire. You do your tape study, you do your workouts when you want. And that worked when this was a very old roster, when you had the killer bees and you had, a defense that felt like everyone was 28 plus, and everyone was bought in to win a Super Bowl because you were in that winning window. Especially on the offensive side, this is a young team right now. And now you have effort concerns for Johnson not falling on a fumble. Why didn't he go pounce on that? George Pickens not blocking. Oh, Warren says he would have, those sorts of things. So I think Eric Bieniemy, and, there were reports at Washington where, he's kind of putting foot in players' asses, and Ron Rivera doesn't normally do that, so they don't know how to do that. I almost think this could be the yin and yang, where Bieniemy's kind of the hard ass to, Tomlin maybe being the good cop, and it could even out some of that relationship, especially on the offensive side of the ball. So I like this a ton. The scheme does kind of worry me, though, after seeing what happened at Washington this year. But, again, how much of that is Howell holding the ball, how much that's the O-line, it's tough to tell. Raheem Morris, I think he's back to the Rams DC. He's an interesting name, though. I could see Atlanta being in on this. A few other teams, honestly. And I mean, what he's done in changing and adapting his defense, it's very on par with what Dan Quinn's done. And that's the mark of a good head coach. Because it's just as a head coach, as much as you're paying for the X's and O's, especially an offensive coach, you're paying Ben Johnson to go to Washington because you want his scheme. And if he's your head coach, he's not leaving. Then he's just got to hire DCs. That's easier to do versus hiring a defensive coach and try to find a different offense that matches what your personnel is, matches what you had before, but also might be better. So it's easier to just pay for the offense for sure. But when you look at a head coach as a CEO, who's willing to change and adapt and grow in a new direction and zig while the rest of the league is zagging, and I think Raheem Morris, Dan Quinn, that's some of the biggest pluses you could have or biggest feathers in their caps, because they're going to look at it like a business. Hey, if things aren't working, we're not going to beat our head against the wall. We're going to change it up and try to be the best version of ourselves. So I like that a ton. I do think he's back in LA to be the defensive coordinator. And man, that Rams team, if they get Stafford back, they could be scary good next year. Patrick Graham, I think he stays in Las Vegas. I think this is going to be an entire retention of staff. I think they keep Pearson. I think they keep Graham. I think they keep that OC that I can't think of. And I just think they keep it status quo. But this could be a guy, and as I listed out here, I think the Raiders would block these interviews, but I could also see a world where it's Antonio Pierce is hey, I don't want to limit you from something that's good for you. If the Chargers are willing to hand you a bag and you're willing to partner up with Harbaugh, go get it. If Ben Johnson's the head coach in Washington and they're willing to make you the highest paid DC in the league, I'm not going to stop you. I could see Antonio Pierce being that guy and then someone who's underneath Graham kind of stepping up and being the DC. Wouldn't shock me, but I do think he's back in Vegas. Brian Callahan, he's getting a ton of head coaching interviews, but to me, I say this with all due respect because who am I? I'm recording this in my guest room. Who the fuck am I to say anything? But I just don't get it. He's not the play caller, and it's not an offense that is really all that flashy. I don't think Zach Taylor does anything that really emulates Sean McVay. I really don't. But maybe Callahan does think more that way. But he's also not the play caller, so we just don't know. But that being said, I could see it in a world, right? Just because he comes from that tree, and maybe he does view offense a little bit more like a Sean McVay than a Zach Taylor does. But also, his dad, maybe he could lure his dad out of retirement. That would be the one thing that kind of pulls me back in. Billy Callahan, there's only 5 to 7 offensive line coaches that people even when I say people know, 5 to 7 offensive line coaches that people deep in the NFL know about. I think about Mike Munchak, and those were the heydays of the Steelers offensive line. Marquise Pouncey, and everything was going great. Mike Munchak was easily one of the best offensive line coaches in the league, and he was a big reason why he leaves. And then it's been a precipitous drop off there for Pittsburgh until the last 2 years. Bill Callahan's one of those guys where if Brian gets a head coaching job, lures his dad out of retirement, all of a sudden, his interview with Carolina becomes interesting, because then it's Bill Callahan working with Ikem Ekwonu, whether he's playing guard or tackle, that's a guy that needs some coaching right now. And Bradley Bozeman, we've seen him play well, but Callahan maybe could be the guy to make sure we get the best of him. I don't know, it's kind of an interesting thought there. And also, inter-offensive lineman, played tackle at BYU. His name's escaping me. But a guy they moved inside to play guard, maybe, Bill Callahan's the guy to get the best out of that. So, I don't know. He could also be a guy, kind of like Frank Smith in this situation where I had him go to Atlanta, gets a chance to actually call plays. That's going to be a big negative, kind of like the Bieniemy risk. Let's see what this guy can actually do as a play caller. Brian Callahan may have the stones be yeah, whatever. I'll go to Seattle to be your offensive coordinator. I'll go to Chicago if they don't get Shane Waldron. I'll be your play caller. I'm up for the job. I'm more than just an offensive coordinator in name. I could be the OC and the play caller. Pittsburgh, another option if he wants to stay in the division. So other options there for Callahan. And I put same for Frank Smith. I already had a prediction for Smith, but just want to put it out there just in case that wasn't clear. Aaron Glenn, I think he continues on as the Lions DC. You know, they weren't great through the air, and he is the former DB's coach in New Orleans, so I think that's a tough sell. But people love him, and like he's one of those guys that I definitely think would be a better head coach than a DC. So maybe he deserves his opportunity. But he's just one of those guys that has utmost respect from everyone across the league, and he's a player's coach. So he could be a guy that, like, if you're looking to reset culture and build a winning program, so to speak, he could be the guy you bring in. And honestly, if that's the move, I think he'll have a lot of interest from OCs and DCs across the league, because it sounds like a lot of people want to work with him too, not just players who want to play for him. Guys want to work with him. So he's been a dark horse head coach. Go on this channel. Go back to literally 2 coaching carousels ago. Not this one, not the one before that, but the one prior to that. So 3 straight coaching cycles where I've been kind of pounding the table for Aaron Glenn. I know he's not a great defensive coordinator, but they've made strides in the right direction. He's been willing to adapt, run less man coverage, and adapt some more zone philosophy in there, and it's worked out for their personnel. But from everything I hear about him as a leader and as a person, you know, I think that's a guy you would want at the front of the locker room. And I think he'd have a lot of interest from OCs, DCs across the league, maybe even getting guys out of retirement to kind of fill those voids, at least right away. Joe Evero, again, I think he stays in Carolina to be the DC. They've already blocked other DC interviews for him. So I think their ideal situation is they hire Mike McCarthy, hire Todd Monken, some offensive mind, and keep Joe Evero around. But he could be a guy that, you know, maybe Carolina lands a Mike McDonald because that's what's left in the coaching carousel. And they say, okay, cool, Joe Evero, you're free to go explore options in, you know, Washington, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, you know, a couple of Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia would be a really fun place for him to go. That could be a great place to turn around that defense and have him get really on the national spotlight and then land a job next coaching carousel. Just some options there. I could see if maybe they land a defensive-minded head coach where Joe Evero does get the opportunity to leave and he gets a bag for it. Steve Wilkes, I think he's back in San Francisco one more year, and then I think he gets some major head coaching interest. If he doesn't land a head coaching job next coaching carousel, I think he does in 2 years. Dave Canales, this is one. I think he's back in Tampa because ultimately I do think they keep Todd Bowles, but I can see a world where, I don't know, if the Bucs lose 35-10 tonight, they move on from Bowles, they fire the entire staff, and Dave Canales has a major overlap with Dan Quinn in Seattle. So that's the one. If he leaves Tampa, I think he goes to Seattle. That would be my prediction there. And this could be a spot where then Bill Belichick maybe is that, you know, Tampa's that mystery team. Bill Belichick comes in and they hire Josh McDaniels, the OC. That one makes a lot of sense to me. I would love to see them not go with McDaniels, the OC, but I could totally see where Bill's just erring on the side of caution there. And I can see where Jason Light's like, yeah, he's been a good OC before. Why are we concerned about it? We're not paying him to be the head coach. So I don't know. If Canales is not in Tampa, I think he's in Seattle. Then Kellen Moore, I think he takes an OC job elsewhere. I don't think Harbaugh would retain him on that LA staff. So Pittsburgh, you know, something I'm keeping my eye on there. If there is turnover in Dallas and Tampa, like that could be interesting. Don't be surprised if he ends up getting a head coaching interview with Carolina. I haven't seen anything where that's happened yet. I've been following that tracker pretty closely. He has not gotten one yet, but I just look at Bryce Young's limitations, and I think Kellen Moore is a guy who I think could coach to that really well. So, like, I could see him be a sleeper in the race, and if Carolina's the last team to make a head coaching hire, he could be the guy that slides in. And keep in mind, the last head coaching hire of the Mike McDaniel head coaching cycle was Mike McDaniel. He was the last one hired. And I look, I know there's questions about Tua right now, but I don't think anybody's questioning Mike McDaniel. I think if he got fired, there'd be 25 teams calling, trying to get him as at least offensive coordinator, more than likely. If he wanted a head coaching job, there'd be 20 teams ready to give him that, if it meant they got their offense, legitimately. So just because he's the last head coaching hire doesn't mean he's not the right one. So Kellen Moore, if the Panthers are the last one, like, don't be surprised if he emerges as a big-time candidate. I think how he played the game kind of lines up with how they might want to have Bryce Young play, and that might be the way to maximize that number 1 overall pick. Mike Kafka, come on, he's lucky to be getting head coaching interviews. And all due respect for an NFL player, and after year 1 in New York, I think there's reason to be excited. This year's a disaster. He needs to rebuild his stock. He needs to stay in New York. Then we get to Anthony Weaver. I think he's defensive line coach, assistant head coach. I think he stays in that role. I think if you're going to hire a culture guy, there's probably guys ahead of this that you would rather have. But who knows? I didn't see other dude man get hired by the Houston Texans. First hire by Nick Caserio. Man's name is escaping me. Apologies for that. He actually did way more than I thought he would. But I think if you're going to go for a culture guy, there's probably guys ahead of the list than Anthony Weaver. Last one here to talk about Chris Tabor. And actually, there's one other guy, Brian Johnson, he just got a head coaching interview this morning. I didn't add him to the graphic. he's another guy where I'd be surprised if he's back in Philadelphia as the OC, let alone as a head coach somewhere else. I just don't see it happening. Chris Tabor, same thing. I just put down a list of everybody who's been interviewed. Tabor, Brian Johnson, I don't see it. I think there's a 0.1% chance those guys get head coaching interviews. Chris Tabor probably gets a special teams coordinator or assistant head coaching job somewhere. Like, I don't know. I keep throwing Pittsburgh out there because they're my team, and I definitely think we can do better than Danny Smith, but I don't know. Just think of a team that's had a disastrous special teams this year. I could totally see where they're like, hey, Chris Tabor, you want to be a special teams coach that's like the highest paid in the league? Which, what is that? I had to look it up, but what, $2 million a year? $1 million a year? Like, how much does a special teams coordinator really get paid? Anyways, long tangent aside, Chris Tabor's probably just a special teams coordinator somewhere, which, hey, not a bad bag to get. Probably one of the highest paid ones when all said and done. But guys, that's going to do it for my head coaching predictions, some offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator hiring positions, and also here on this other guys list, my kind of thoughts on some of these candidates and where they end up going next year. So long video, apologize for that, way longer than I thought it would be, but let me know your thoughts down below. Who ends up in Atlanta, Los Angeles, Las Vegas? Who's going to be the guy in Dallas? Do you think they move on from McCarthy, or am I just making that up? And then what about some of these head coaching candidates? Where does Eric Bieniemy go? Where's Patrick Graham landing? Where's Aaron Glenn, Brian Callahan, Mike Kafka, Kellen Moore, all these guys, Dave Canales, all these guys on your screen right now? Let me know where you think some of these names end up next season as a coordinator, or if you think they end up getting a head coaching race, where do they end up? Love to hear your thoughts. Of course, that's why I started the channel. Let me hear your thoughts and opinions down below in the comment section. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hit that like button if you did. Subscribe if you're new to the channel and want to see more football content like this. But I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, my name is Tej, and I am signing off.